Greetings. I'm going to give a talk entitled Tradition and Christianity, so I hope you enjoy it. Christianity has had a fascinating past, and uniquely for an object of knowledge, we should look to the past rather than the present. This completely contradicts the doctrine of science and progress, which likes to constantly improve on things, but really we owe it to ourselves and our spirituality to pay due heed to tradition. When was the pinnacle of Christian strength and doctrine? I would argue in the Summa Theologica of St. Thomas Aquinas, yet already in that century decline set in, and not long after we had nominalism, which was a terrible spiritual dilution of doctrine. Now, nominalism occurred perhaps as a result of the Black Death, which killed a third of people in Europe, and led to profound uncertainty in God. This led to William of Ockham's decidedly unwise and unspiritual theology of an unpredictable, willful deity. Today Catholics still use Aquinas as the gold standard, but already in the Middle Ages, mainstream academic culture was moving away from his great edifice of knowledge and wisdom. It was as though nothing could be added, and the only possible result was decline. So there is a decline more or less from after the time of Aquinas, whether done Scotus univocalism, which taught that God was the highest being and not beyond being, or Ockham's nominalism, which taught that universals did not have real existence. These seemingly fine theological and philosophical points actually had tremendous implications. Univocity suggested God was somehow commensurate with his creation, at the top of the pyramid of creation and not radically beyond, that is, the container of all existence and stretching infinitely beyond existence. To merely posit God as the highest being, rather than the necessary ontological ground of all existence, laid the first paving stone on the path towards atheistic tendencies, which would flourish many centuries later. Additionally, nominalism, by banishing universals, did great damage to people's conception of the intelligible realm, laying the first paving stone towards materialism, which again would flourish centuries later. The Protestant Reformation obviously contained many errors, and Luther did great damage to mainstream theology. His sola scriptura and dislike of Christian Platonic tradition effectively wrecked the fruitful combination of Greek philosophy and scripture which had existed since the earliest church fathers. His sola fide was a terrible misinterpretation of St. Paul, who did not say faith is the only necessary criterion for salvation, but made it clear that moral action was paramount. And the schism in the Western Church undoubtedly weakened Christendom and opened the door to more deviant forms of dissension. Obviously Calvin is so aberrant that little needs to be said to persuade the reader of his error. The idea of hideously over-literalized predestination without the capacity for freedom to affect personal destiny made a mockery of salvation. But these were still believing Christians. It was just that their errors and deviations weakened and fractured the faith. Descartes was of course a great turning point. His dualism of spirit and extension was nothing like the classic Platonic dualism of sensible and intelligible, which was wholly organic, or Aristotle's form and matter, which again was really an organic combination and in line with traditional metaphysics. Descartes' formulation truly laid the ground for materialism, because he hived off spirit from body, putting it in a separate realm, and with the delight of the physicist, focused on body by establishing mechanism, and was quite prepared to forget spirit until it would be dropped altogether by later philosophers. Descartes demonstrates the folly of the natural philosopher relegating the spiritual to secondary importance. Additionally, his thought experiments in the Meditations were by traditional standards bizarre. Traditionally, meditations had been spiritual exercises, and here he totally perverted the sense of the term, creating a new paradigm. His uncertainty belied his spiritual turmoil. Unfortunately, Descartes unleashed his spiritual illness on the world by appropriating Sextus Empiricus' radical skepticism and applying it to the 17th century. How could anyone be in such existential turmoil with the certainty of God? Surely Descartes was not a strong believer. The story from there is sad. Mechanism bred materialism, and by the 18th century thinkers like David Hume had declared their atheism, stating that only empirical things have any reality at all. One can see how the first step here was nominalism. Then science dealt body blows to religious confidence, especially with Darwin, and there was witness to decline in morals commented on by successive popes, until we had the dreadful acceleration of the moral decline of the 20th century, and that is the story of the gradual retreat of traditional doctrine and values. So that concludes the talk. I hope you found it useful. Thank you for listening.